All right, guys. So essentially, what I'm going to talk about is the nitrogen cycle and keystone species again, right? And not much to talk about here. It's very brief and not too much detail. Just going to move this here so you guys can see the little drawings. So the nitrogen cycle, very similar to the carbon cycle, is extremely important, right? For living organisms. Again, I've been mentioning many times that these compounds, these elements are always ping-ponging, right? Are dancing between the abiotic factors and biotic factors within an ecosystem, right? Of course, you guys know N starts, N is the symbol for nitrogen. And nitrogen, of course, is a very critical element for living things, right? And the reason why we need it primarily is because of proteins and nucleic acids. If you guys remember when we talked about the biomolecules, right? The first one you see here, which are proteins, all right? They have this certain kind of structure here where you have a central carbon and you have an R group, which is a miscellaneous group that gives each amino acid its property, so that can vary. All right, you have a carboxyl group here. What I want you to emphasize on is that proteins have an amino group, and that amino group has that nitrogen atom within it, right? So you can't have an amino acid without the nitrogen, without this these components here. So of course, every amino acid is involved in development of proteins, right? And you can't have an amino group without having nitrogen, right? So it's so critical for us to be having and bringing in nitrogen into our bodies. Okay, so that's in terms of proteins. Of course, proteins govern a lot of the maintenance and structure and function of our body, of our cells, of our tissues. So it's indispensable that we need nitrogen aside from carbon, right? So this is regarding proteins. Regarding nucleic acids, if you guys remember, nucleic acids like DNA and RNA are made up of these building blocks called nucleotides, right? And this is an example of a nucleotide that you see here. Okay, a nucleotide is made up of three parts: this phosphate group, a sugar, and a base. Moreover, it's called a nitrogenous base. And here you have the A in the example, adenine, right? In DNA, you know, you have T, A, G, and C, right? But nevertheless, there are slight differences in their chemistry, but they all have nitrogens. And look at adenine. Look how many nitrogens you have here. It's so essential for that overall ring structure of adenine. So you can see it's very critical to have nitrogen. Of course, these nucleotides are the building blocks of DNA, and we all know, you know, the importance of DNA. It houses the information to create the protein to give us the structure and the function that we need for our body to thrive, right? So nitrogen, very critical. Okay, and the nitrogen cycle, of course, has many processes similar to the carbon cycle, right? If you were to start here in the atmosphere, okay, you have, let me just zoom in here for a bit, right? You have atmospheric nitrogen that's in the form of N2. This is a form really that we can assimilate easily in our body. We're breathing in nitrogen gas all the time, but we expel it very easily. Okay, as it comes in, it comes back out, because our systems, our lungs aren't refined to kind of process nitrogen. So nitrogen has to be processed in another way before we can use it, right? So how that works in this nitrogen cycle is that there's several ways in which this atmospheric nitrogen can be processed before it goes into our bodies. And some of these, if we go in this direction here, there's several ways that it can be processed. One, it isn't the most abundant way, but it does happen every now and then, is that actually nitrogen can be changed, or another word for change is actually fixation. Okay, that nitrogen is being converted into another form. Okay, it's referred to as fixation. You're going to see this word a lot in this little subsection here. It can be fixed by lightning. Okay, lightning has enough energy to change the chemical compound of nitrogen gas, atmospheric nitrogen, into another form. All right, so one way by fixing nitrogen is by lightning. All right, within the soil, there's certain organisms that can fix nitrogen gas, which is bacteria that live in the soil, right? And there's some even more specialized bacteria that they actually live in little nodes. And I'm going to take I'm going to show you more in detail in a little bit, of plants, right? They're also referred to as nitrogen fixers, right? These bacteria. So they also fix nitrogen into a form that we can use. Okay, so these three forms come in and they change nitrogen into a form that other organisms can use, mostly, okay, in the form of ammonia, right? So these organisms, bacteria, and these symbiotic relationship of bacteria and a plant, right? These are two different things. There's free bacteria that are in the soil, and there's other bacteria that are more specialized, that they actually live in these little nodules here. All right, they help fix bacteria, and moreover, they can fix it into nitrogen into ammonia, right? So nitrogen is changing to different forms. All right, other ways that nitrogen can get into the soil to be processed is, of course, by waste, right? Feces, even urination, more fluid forms of nitrogen, like urine, urea, right, is coming down. Ultimately, decomposers, like worms, other bacteria, fungi, can come in and change nitrogen into ammonia, right? We still can't use ammonia. Ammonia is a little bit poisonous to us, actually. So after that, you have other types of bacteria that can convert this ammonia, right, into another form that are referred to as nitrites. Okay, it's referred to as nitrites, and those bacteria that can change ammonia into a nitrite, designated by NO2 negative, right? So this is an anion, if you remember from chemistry. These bacteria are called nitrifiers. Okay, they're referred to as nitrifiers, and these nitrifiers change this nitrite into this ammonia into nitrites. Many organisms can use this form, actually, but we need an even more sustainable form, which is called a nitrate. And all the difference is that instead of 2 oxygen molecules, you have 3 oxygen atoms. Sorry. Okay. But still, you're nitrifying. You're turning it into an NO compound, a nitrogen oxide compound. Okay, and when you have 3 oxygen, is referred to as nitrates, and these nitrates is basically what could be assimilated could be absorbed by plants, right? Which in turn, consumers come in and eat the plants, and that's how they get nitrogen, right? Again, we also us, that we eat some vegetables, we eat our nitrates there, we eat other consumers that eat the vegetables, the herbivores, and so forth, right? Aside from that, having nitrates to be circulating within the food chains, there are other kinds of bacteria that can actually denitrify. They can denitrify these compounds, right? And instead of having NO3, it can return back nitrogen into the atmosphere, actually along with oxygen into the atmosphere. So they're referred to as denitrifiers. All right. So they help moderate the amount of nitrogen and keep it in circulation within this whole cycle, right? So in essence, I gave you a brief overview of the entire nitrogen cycle there and all the points that I'm going to talk about. Okay, this is essentially what you need to know. I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail regarding nitrogen fixers and bacteria here. All right. Like I mentioned before, these are just notes that you guys can see from the link on the OneNote. Here, plants take up nitrogen from the soil in the form of ammonia or nitrates. Yeah, some animals and plants can assimilate ammonia, right? Definitely we do not, right? We do not. As I mentioned, lightning can also react to turn nitrogen into other compounds. That whole process, and you're going to be seeing this anytime you're dealing with nitrogen and you want to change it into another form, it's referred to as nitrogen fixation, right? Essentially getting it from the atmosphere and turning it into another compound, right? Usually by bacteria, okay? 80% of nitrogen is actually in the air, right? Of course, we can't use that, like I was mentioning before. Okay, and this gaseous nitrogen is converted into nitrites and nitrates by nitrogen fixation because of these bacteria. All right. More specifically, I want you guys to know this and memorize this. Okay, let me just put this here. There's some, not all plants do this. There's some special kind of plants, specific species of plants that are able to have a relationship with bacteria, a symbiotic relationship. The Azotobacter and the Rhizobium genuses of plants, they're a group of legumes, and these bacteria, these are the bacteria that grow on legume plants. Sorry, let me clear that up. These are bacterial species that grow on specific kinds of plants, right? And they grow on the roots, right, of these plants. And those areas that they grow in, that they multiply, you can see them if I zoom in here. All right. And they produce little nodules, these little bulbs, these little spheres that you see here, but not there, but throughout the whole root, right? They're referred to as little nodules. And it's there that they're growing and they're fixing bacteria. They're not harmful for the plant, actually. The plant is receiving nitrogen from the bacteria, and the bacteria is actually obtaining glucose, carbon from the plant, right? So they have a symbiotic relationship of mutualism. Okay, so here you can get an example of the plant species. You have a pea plant, which is a type of legume. You can see the root nodules of these plants. And there's many plant species that actually produce a lot of seeds, and these seeds can house a lot of nitrogen. Okay, not an extraordinary high amount, but you do have a good source of nitrogen, of nitrates within seeds, right? Okay, you don't necessarily have to be living with a plant. There's some bacteria that live freely in the soil. This is what I kind of mentioned in the diagram there. It also fix nitrogen into ammonia, okay, and nitrates there. All right. More specifically regarding nitrifiers, they serve, okay, if you guys remember here, these nitrifiers that are other kinds of bacteria that I mentioned, right? They can get this ammonia and they could convert it into nitrites, right? And let me just get over here. And these bacteria can grow on decaying matter, right? Decaying materials, and that decaying material, one waste product is ammonia also, which can which these bacteria can process, right? That again, I've been mentioning decaying matter, organic matter, detritus, right, which is basically feces, the urine that I mentioned, dead plants and animals, all that stuff. They can extract that nitrogen and turn it into a nitrite. Okay. What's interesting is that this reaction does liberate heat, all right? To produce nitrite, a byproduct of this reaction is liberating heat that the bacteria can also use as a form of energy to build their own compounds. So they're kind of benefiting too in these reactions, right? Using a form of energy there. Denitrifiers, again, the opposite of what I was mentioning, where they could get the nitrates and turn back into gaseous nitrogen, releasing back into the atmosphere along with oxygen in the process. Because remember, nitrites and nitrates have nitrogen and oxygen there. Okay, this is in particular very helpful because some bacteria that live in soil that has very poor aeration, that could provide air for plants that live there, right? So that can give some supplement of oxygen to plants, all right? Regarding the oceans, how do aquatic organisms get nitrogen, right? This is pretty much from rain, pretty much from runoff, right? Runoff is water that is coming from water and going down, sorry, not coming from mountainous or higher elevation areas down to lower elevation areas. And as this is coming off, you know, water is carrying nitrogen from the soil, from the bacteria that are fixing the nitrogen, and they're seeping it through into the ocean, right? It could be either as nitrates, it could be either as ammonium, but you're getting that nitrogen compound and not the gas into the ocean there, right? And different organisms can process that these nitrates as they need, right? Within the aquatic environment there. All right. It does happen. Why is this cut off? Okay. Similar to carbon, nitrogen also gets, you know, not all the quantity of nitrogen that is running down into the ocean gets used. Some of it sinks to the bottom to become part of the sediment, which gets compacted, becomes part of the Earth's layer over many, 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 many years, which goes down to the deeper layers and back to the mantle, back to the lithosphere, where it'll become, you know, a magma again and lava again, and can be released back by volcanic emissions, right? In terms of the amount that's in the water to begin off with, right? So you have a general cycle. I don't think it shows that here. Yeah, but it's very similar to the carbon cycle there. Okay, so in terms of understanding what you need to know in for the nitrogen cycle, you have ammonia, nitrates, and nitrites. You have nitrogen gas. Ammonia and ammonium is a form that could easily get confused. Again, similar to nitrites and nitrates, it's just a matter of the amount of hydrogens in the case of ammonia. Ammonia is what we release, organisms can release, right? NH3. Ammonium ions is NH4 plus, which is a cation to be reacting to other compounds there. All right. So that's in regards to nitrogen, the nitrogen cycle. And the last thing, guys, very briefly, that I just want to explain, you guys already should know what keystone species are. They're those species that have a very large effect within a community, within a population, within the ecosystem, and taking them out of the ecosystem can make the community, make the ecosystem out of balance, right? And these keystone species are generally in lower numbers, right? But they help maintain other populations in balance, right? There are many examples of keystone species. I hear I put here several more examples that you guys can have so you guys can understand why they're important, right? Keystone species, they're niche, have highly influential relationships, right, with other species. Some examples that you guys need to know, right? What can a keystone species do in an ecosystem? Keep other populations in balance. I mentioned this one before, but I'm kind of reiterating that. The sea otter. The sea otter eats sea urchin, right? And why is this important? And I'm going to just write the sea urchin right here. And then you have your sea otter. This is important because the sea urchin, not shown in the picture, eat a lot of kelp, an extraordinarily amount of kelp in short periods of time. And kelp, that brown kelp forest, serves as like a nursery, serves as a home to many, many different organisms. And if you damage that, you're going to wipe out the whole ecosystem, right? Not to that extent, but it's going to be greatly, greatly impacted there. So it helps keep other populations in balance. It can help recycle nutrients in the case of the termites, right? Throughout the ecosystem, throughout a certain period of time, a lot of trees, their material can get recycled by these termites. Okay, they can help in seed dispersal, like the cassowary, right? You have this bird that looks like the ostrich, very similar to the ostrich. They help disperse seeds over long distances. Okay, so they do help plant populations, tree populations, the cassowary. And again, I want to mention another form of population, keeping populations in balance, is predation with a purple sea star, right? This sea star, called Pisaster ochraceus, is a natural predator of mussels. Right? I didn't show it here, but it's right here. Right? Mussels, you can see here, it's preying on one here. There's many, many all over here. And it's usually found in the intertidal zone of the seashore area, basically. And having these sea stars, they keep the mussel population in check, because if you were to lower the sea star population, these mussels will grow everywhere on the rock and displace a lot of other species like limpets, like barnacles, okay, other organisms that kind of attach on the rock. They'll take them out, right? Because they have a very efficient reproduction rate, and they pretty much multiply easily, and they don't need that much resources actually. So there's a study conducted by Robert Payne that he actually developed the idea of keystone species, where he used these sea stars and investigated their influence in the community, right? And all in all, right, he quantitatively saw that the importance of keystone species, and that's from his work. You started to get from many different scientists policies on conservation and management of keystone species to conserve overall biodiversity. Because in his study, let's take a look at his study here. He collected data and compared two intertidal zones, and he used as a control, of course, what you see naturally, the sea star called Pisaster. And he saw that the number of species variety was pretty much balanced there. It didn't get affected at all in the control group. But in another intertidal zone, he removed the sea stars, and he noticed that the species diversity, the number of species that were in the intertidal zone, started to decrease because the mussels were kicking out a lot of species there, right? So he got the idea of the keystone species because of that, right? So species greatly, greatly diminished there. Okay, so these keystone species they exert an influence on the community as a whole. All right. Good. So it's good to know some examples of Keystone species now that you can get a sense of food chains and food webs and energy pyramids and um, uh, how communities and populations work on their different relationships. You can get a better understanding of how Keystone species work and how, in general, an ecosystem maintains its balance there. There's only a little bit more we need to talk about regarding ecosystems, but essentially we'll be done. Like maybe in 2 more weeks, we can finish uh, the whole concept of Keystone species. Of course, we need to do other things, but yeah, we'll when we get there. All right, guys. So that's it for this lesson. I'll give you a short little task to do on the Google Classroom for you guys to do. All right, over